When a government appoints a new supreme leader, while enemy aircraft are still operating over its capital, it is not conducting an orderly institutional ceremony. It is issuing a message, calculated, deliberate, and aimed at multiple audiences simultaneously. That is what Iran's Assembly of Experts did on March 8, 2026, when it named Mojtaba Khamenei to succeed his father as the Islamic Republic's highest authority. The selection came exactly 8 days after U.S. and Israeli strikes killed the elder Khamenei, and its significance extends far beyond the internal politics of a nation at war. It reveals something important about how the Islamic Republic intends to survive this conflict, how markets are now pricing the prospect of prolonged disruption in the world's most strategically exposed energy corridor, and why the logic of this crisis may prove more durable than any single military operation. The death of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei on February 28, 2026, under conditions of active bombardment, was itself a departure from anything the Islamic Republic had confronted in its nearly 5 decades of existence. The 1979 revolution displaced a monarchy and built a theocratic system deliberately designed to resist foreign coercion. Its founding architecture assumed that supreme authority would be untouchable in the conventional sense, insulated by ideology, by clerical legitimacy, and by geography. That assumption did not survive the opening hours of the U.S.-Israeli campaign. The killing of the supreme leader during the first salvo of those operations immediately created a constitutional and strategic vacuum. How Iran filled that vacuum in the days that followed has now become one of the defining questions of the crisis. Under Articles 107 through 111 of the Iranian Constitution, the Assembly of Experts, an 88-member clerical body, holds the sole authority to appoint a new supreme leader. The process is meant to proceed swiftly in the event of the leader's death or incapacitation. What is remarkable about what occurred between February 28th and March 8th is not that the Assembly moved quickly, it is that it moved with apparent coherence under bombardment, producing a candidate whose selection U.S. President Donald Trump had publicly declared unacceptable just days before. Trump stated that Mojtaba Khamenei would not be a tolerable outcome, describing him as a lightweight and implying that Washington expected some role in shaping the transition's direction. The Assembly's decision, announced publicly on March 8th and confirmed by Iranian state media the following morning, was a direct institutional answer to that pressure. The choice of Mojtaba Khamenei, who makes history as the Islamic Republic's first case of what effectively amounts to hereditary succession, carries layers of meaning that are worth examining carefully. His reported ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Iran's most powerful and operationally aggressive military institution, suggest that the succession was not designed to open diplomatic pathways. The IRGC, which reports directly to the supreme leader and has been the primary instrument of Iran's retaliatory campaign against Israel and Gulf Arab states, now holds a direct organizational stake in the legitimacy of the new leadership. That structural alignment matters enormously for understanding the trajectory of the conflict. The IRGC is not simply a military force, it is an economic and political institution embedded in the Iranian state, and its proximity to the new supreme leader signals that the institutions conducting the war and the institution now commanding the state are operating in close coordination. The retaliatory campaign Iran has mounted since February 28th reflects the scale of what is now underway. Ballistic missile and drone strikes have struck Israeli territory. Gulf Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain, have reported Iranian attacks on their territory, including strikes on energy infrastructure. Saudi Arabia reported intercepting drones targeting its Sheba oil field. Bahrain's national energy company declared force majeure on oil shipments after a strike on the Sitra refinery area. More troubling from the perspective of the alliance system is what happened over Turkey. NATO defenses intercepted a missile reportedly headed toward Incirlik Air Base on March 5th, and Turkish authorities reported a second missile entry into their airspace 4 days later. Iran has denied targeting Turkey on both occasions. The discrepancy between those denials and the intercepts recorded by NATO systems has not been resolved. It has, however, placed Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the Mutual Defense Clause, into active consideration in a way that would have seemed unlikely at the outset of the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz, closed to commercial tanker traffic since March 2nd, is where the military and economic dimensions of this crisis converge most visibly. The strait is not merely a shipping route, it is the single most consequential choke point in the global energy system. Approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products moved through it daily in 2025, representing roughly 20% of global oil supply. A meaningful portion of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through the same corridor. There are no practical alternatives at the scale required to replace Hormuz. The Suez Canal cannot absorb the volume. The overland routes across the Arabian Peninsula exist in limited form and were never designed for full-scale export replacement. The physical closure of the strait for any sustained period is not a regional disruption. It is a global supply event. Markets recognized that reality almost immediately. On March 8th and 9th, Brent crude briefly approached $120 per barrel, its highest level since 2022, representing an intraday gain among the largest seen in recent years. West Texas Intermediate moved in parallel. The price signal rippled outward through every market sensitive to energy costs. Japan's Nikkei fell more than 7%. South Korea's Kospi briefly triggered circuit breakers. European indices dropped across the board. U.S. futures pointed lower. Inflation expectations, already fragile after 2 years of attempted normalization by central banks, moved sharply in the wrong direction. The Federal Reserve's expected path of rate cuts for 2026 narrowed. The 10-year Treasury yield climbed above 4.17%. American drivers saw gasoline prices increase by approximately 50 cents per gallon in a single week, with some regions crossing the $4 threshold. What markets are pricing is not merely the immediate disruption. They are pricing a risk premium that reflects the possibility that this disruption may persist. Every day that the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed adds structural pressure to global supply balances. Gulf producers, including the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, have announced output reductions, not because they have chosen to cut production, but because with export routes disrupted and storage capacity filling, they have limited alternatives. Saudi Arabia finds itself in a similar position. The Gulf Cooperation Council states were not the initiators of this conflict, but they are absorbing its costs in ways that are becoming difficult to contain politically. Iran's attacks on their territory, which Saudi Arabia's foreign ministry has described as based on flimsy pretexts, have created a set of pressures on Gulf governments whose populations are now experiencing both the threat of missile strikes and the economic disruption of a war they did not choose. The G7, recognizing the severity of what is unfolding, was scheduled to convene finance ministers on March 9th to discuss a coordinated release from strategic petroleum reserves. The International Energy Agency has been involved in those discussions. If implemented, a coordinated reserve release would be designed to signal price ceilings and prevent a sustained move above $100 per barrel from becoming entrenched in inflation expectations. Such mechanisms have been deployed before, most notably in 2022, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine drove a comparable commodity shock. The parallel is instructive, but imperfect. The 2022 shock involved disruption to a major producer. What is unfolding now involves potential closure of the transit corridor through which multiple major producers export simultaneously. The scale of the choke point risk is structurally different. The diplomatic picture is fragmented and, in several important ways, represents a reconfiguration of relationships that have been building for years. China dispatched a special envoy, and its top diplomat, Wang Yi, called publicly for the end of military action and a return to negotiations. Russia's Vladimir Putin moved swiftly to congratulate Mojtaba Khamenei and reaffirm what he described as unwavering support for Tehran. Neither Moscow nor Beijing participated in the military campaign, and both have strategic and economic interests in the conflict's outcome that are sharply divergent from Washington's. The United Kingdom's government, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, acknowledged that British personnel are co-located with U.S. forces and that intelligence is being shared, while publicly maintaining a posture of non-participation in strikes. Australia has confirmed it is reviewing requests for defensive military support from Gulf states. The conflict is drawing lines that do not map neatly onto the alliance architectures of the previous decade. Iran's retaliatory strikes on Gulf Arab states add a dimension that deserves particular attention. Qatar's prime minister described the attacks as a betrayal. These are not adversarial states from Tehran's perspective in the traditional sense. They are neighbors with whom Iran has conducted decades of uneasy but commercially significant relationships. The fact that Iranian strikes are now landing in Bahrain, the UAE, and near Saudi oil infrastructure suggests that Iranian military planners are operating under a doctrine that treats Gulf Arab complicity with the U.S.-Israeli campaign as sufficient justification for strikes on their territory. Whether that calculation is accurate, it has the effect of potentially widening the conflict's geographic footprint and complicating the political position of governments whose populations are already feeling the economic pressure of elevated energy costs. The Trump administration's public posture has been notably calibrated on the economic dimension. The president's statement that rising oil prices represent a small price to pay was an attempt to manage domestic political expectations while holding the strategic course. At the same time, U.S. polling has shown growing opposition to the campaign as casualties have mounted. 7 confirmed U.S. service member deaths as of March 9th, and as gasoline prices have become a tangible daily experience for ordinary American households. The administration has simultaneously called for G7 reserve releases, which implicitly acknowledges that the price trajectory is not politically sustainable over the medium term, even while publicly dismissing the concern. That tension between strategic ambition and economic tolerance is likely to become more pronounced the longer the Strait of Hormuz remains closed. There is also the question that sits beneath all the others: Iran's nuclear program. The new supreme leader now holds command authority over Iranian military strategy and over the decisions surrounding the country's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Reporting has indicated that the location of that stockpile is not fully known to U.S. and Israeli intelligence, and that consideration is being given to operations aimed at securing or neutralizing it. Mojtaba Khamenei's relationship to that question, whether he would accelerate weaponization under conditions of existential military pressure or whether different calculations would apply, is the most consequential unknown in the entire situation. His first public statement and policy signals, none of which have yet been issued, will be watched with a level of analytical intensity that reflects just how much depends on the answer. What the events of the past 10 days reveal is something that runs deeper than any single military campaign or leadership transition. The Islamic Republic, confronted with the killing of its supreme leader and the sustained bombardment of its territory, made a succession decision that functioned primarily as a signal to its own population, to the IRGC, to regional actors, and to Washington, that the institutional architecture of the state had not collapsed. The speed of the appointment, the profile of the chosen successor, the public defiance embedded in ignoring Trump's explicit objection, all communicated the same message. The state intends to continue. Markets, in their own way, communicated a parallel message. The pricing of oil above $100 per barrel is not simply a reaction to disrupted tanker routes. It is a pricing of the possibility that the strategic geography of global energy supply has entered a period of uncertainty whose duration no one can confidently project. That is the deeper architecture of what is unfolding. A conflict that began as a military operation targeting the Iranian regime's apex leadership has produced a succession that entrenches the very continuity it was presumably intended to interrupt. An energy corridor that the global economy assumed would remain open is closed for the 11th consecutive day, and a set of alliance systems, energy dependencies, and institutional pressures that have been quietly accumulating for years are now active simultaneously. The visible events, a new leader named, oil prices spiking, markets falling, are real enough. But the more consequential question is whether the structural conditions that made this crisis possible have changed, or whether the crisis has simply made them visible.